Historical studies needs decolonisation, apparently. In the past years, there has been an increasing emphasis on making historical education in schools and universities more inclusive and less stained by the apparent sins of empire and imperialism. This is particularly the case in the United Kingdom and Australia, where it has become more fashionable to explore the British Empire through the perspectives of non-whites and conquered populations, as opposed to, say, the British royal family or ethnic Britons. There is also a boom in Indigenous history and ongoing debates about Australian history, particularly Australia Day on January 26th, which marks the first fleet coming into Sydney during the late 18th century. But to Indigenous activists, Australia Day is actually Invasion Day. This speaks to a growing conflict in how Western countries see past histories of imperialism and conquest. Hence the push by many academics and activists to decolonize history. It's not just the British Empire either. Other empires and imperial projects, such as Tsarist Russia, the Second German Empire, France in Africa, the Ottomans, and Spanish expansion in the Americas, is also under deep scrutiny. I'd argue it's not wise to decolonize history. There's a danger in following political crazes, not thinking carefully about decolonization as a concept, and unintentionally endorsing new nationalisms. This video makes the case against decolonizing history. Colonization is neither condemned or condoned here, nor should we make excessive moral judgments. Historians can certainly illuminate the past better right now without submitting themselves to an absence of critical thinking. That's why we must view decolonization with a critical eye and not mindlessly embrace it. I'm Madeleine Rose-Jones, and I study history, literature, and culture. Welcome to Snowy Fictions. Argument 1. Power structures of colonialism remain. Empires come and go. Such is the nature of history. Throughout time, the desire and use for power has shaped much of humanity and has seen the ascendancy of nations and fall of empires. In the 15th century, Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople and made it submit to Ottoman rule. Using his top-down power, he fashioned a minaret outside the Hagia Sophia, thus turning the Byzantine church into a mosque, alongside other places in Constantinople. On first glance, this showed Ottoman colonization across the Bosphorus. It's similar to the Russian Empire, forcing the Cyrillic script onto a conquered population, such as the Lithuanians or the Estonians. To a historian seeking decolonization, these indicate colonial powers forcing cultural, linguistic, and religious changes down on a conquered population. But I'd go even further than that. Colonization is an expression of biological and social realities fundamental to being human. We are a species capable of hierarchies, power games, and competition. This was certainly shown in the 19th century, where the British Empire and Imperial Russia engaged in the Great Game outside of Europe. The United Kingdom today is hardly its former self, but the power structures of colonialism remain embedded within every country, every human soul. As individuals, we certainly have the capacity to tyrannize, to control, to subdue, and to make demands. Historians, despite their pretty words, can do this too. I cannot help but think that decolonizing history means changing the ways humans interact with one another and making adjustments to biological realities. This is not a realistic goal to have, and not one I encourage you to share. Argument 2. Trading one nationalism for another. Academics have sought to decolonize Eurasian and Eastern European studies from Russian imperialism, whether Tsarist Russia or the Soviet Union. These requests are certainly passionate since the Russo-Ukrainian War, but let's look critically at decolonization's meaning here. To decolonize a field of history can mean changing one's research focus, using specific terminology, focusing on histories of indigenous peoples, and trying to connect historic cultures with the imperial project. That's why in Britain, it's not uncommon for a literary scholar with a decolonist perspective to interrogate the connection between Jane Austen, tea, and empire. So often, this scholarship morphs into an argument against British nationalism, identity, and history, as shown in books like Empireland or the many research projects shaping Anglo academia. There is a problem with this. Decolonization efforts are just as ideological possessed and driven by nationalist sentiment, or our response to it, as nationalistic imperial historiography. I question whether decolonizing history is actually an honest method of doing history. It seeks to purify the past, as opposed to understanding and describing it. In addition, it's clear that Eurasian studies, in particular, has attracted many nationalists who, while not Russian themselves, have certainly a view of the past incredibly shaped by nationalistic sentiments and history. Ukrainian history is an unfortunate example of this, as there is a huge push to tone police how academics spell and pronounce city names and that of groups. As a result, we trade Russian nationalism for Ukrainian, Lithuanian, and Georgian nationalism. We're still bound by the view of Eurasia dictated by national identity. The only thing changing is who our favourite nation is. This is not good for the objective study of history. Whilst every historian has their own biases and worldview, it is possible to present Eurasian history based on fair claims made from primary source materials. It's also noticeable that many academics think they have to respond to ongoing crises in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and in China. And a historian certainly does have responsibilities, but they don't have to carry the entire weight of the world on their shoulders. Of course, it makes sense for academics to have their own viewpoints and to take passion and pride in their national identity. I have nothing against that at all. In fact, I think it's a positive. But the historical field as a whole must not submit to a particular strand of nationalism. Rather, high standards of scholarship must shape our study and writing of history. Argument 3. The need for a critical look on decolonization. Ultimately, decolonization is one approach of many to historical studies. The process of decolonization post-World War II, as shown in the French, Portuguese, and British empires, is also a moment in time, among others. This is never immune from scrutiny and debate. Decolonization in modern history wasn't necessarily some joyful event where freely liberated souls could live as they always wanted. This didn't happen in the Balkans at all, where extreme levels of ethnic hatred and genocide shaped the 20th century. Likewise, two states of the Soviet Union, Azerbaijan and Armenia, have spent the last 2 decades absolutely not at peace and at war. Decolonizing a nation does not guarantee anything. It's not a magical wand which makes nations more equal, fairer, or prosperous. We need to see decolonization not as what it could be, but what it actually has been in the past. Idealism must not cloud our historical thinking. You can certainly have a positive view on decolonization, or that empires shouldn't remain forever. We need a more nuanced and thoughtful approach to decolonization, which considers historical and geopolitical realities. We shouldn't ignore the many aspects of decolonization which may cause discomfort, like the sheer amount of ethnic violence, chaos, and bitter hatreds, or that newly independent countries in Africa did struggle in many regards. So often, the utter disgust and condemnation blasted towards colonialism means a glorification of decolonization. That's also why we shouldn't just study empires, but also the process of empires breaking up and new states forming. There is no need to decolonize history, but it's important we have a concrete understanding of how empires rise, thrive, and then decline, and what takes their place. This will mean studying history from a variety of perspectives, from soldiers to princes to common subjects. It's impossible to cover everything in a class, but we can encourage students to see history in not an excessively moral light, but to see it as ever-changing, full of consequence and complexity. I'm concerned at the many black and white approach many decolonization types advocate for. There's frankly too much idealization and demonization going on, which is simply not conducive to studying history. If you are a historian studying empire, or say the Balkans or South Asia in contemporary times, I absolutely do encourage you in your pursuit. I have no issue with those studying either colonization or decolonization. My ultimate problem is when the entire field of history is portrayed as needing decolonization. I encourage you to share your thoughts about decolonization in the comments below. If you'd like, subscribe for frequent videos on history, literature, and culture. I also have a mailing list, a blog, and creative writing classes linked below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you soon.